I recently asked on my Instagram who would like to see an episode where I explain how to use the SF20. And a lot of you guys really wanted that. So here we are. And a little disclaimer, this is how I use the flash. And with all things, there are multiple ways to go about it. But this works for me. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk It Over. So first, let's check out the flash itself. At the front, it's pretty clean. We have, of course, the logo with the name of the flash on it, a sensor, which I never use, but we'll get into that a little bit later, and of course, the light source itself. It has a diffuser, and I always keep it on, just for protection, but it also spreads the light a little bit more, so more coverage. It's easy to remove it, and there you can see the light bulb. On the back, you have everything to set the desired output with an LCD screen. On the left, we have a plus and minus sign to adjust everything up or down. And if you hold them both at the same time, the LCD screen lights up. Nice to know if you use this flash in a dark situation. Below that, we have a little light, which is also pressable. This light turns green when the unit is ready to use. If you press it, you can trigger the flash. And this is nice when you need to check the flash output with an external light meter. Next to that, we have a button which is the power setting. If you press this button, you can set the power using the plus and minus buttons on the left side. It goes all the way from 1 to 1, which is full power, to 1/8. When you're looking at the screen, you can see that the distance changes too. This is the distance that you need to have from you and your subject. So for instance, if your subject is 5 meters away, you'll need to set it at that. You can set this scale also to feet, but I don't know how anymore. But for those who use that system, it's possible. Next to the power button, we have the aperture button. Here you set your desired aperture. I like to set my aperture to f11 for most of the stuff that I do with flash. This way I can keep my distance closer to my subject without overpowering the flash, and it's easier to zone focus. Next to the aperture button is the ISO button. Here you put the ISO of your film. I shoot a lot of Portra 800, but I like to overexpose it by one stop. So I set this to 400. It can be a little bit tricky to calculate and think about overexposing with flash, also when pushing film. So I like to think, set the ISO of the flash the same as you set your internal meter on your body. For instance, if I shoot Ilford HP5, which is a 400 speed film, and I like to push that 2 stops. So I rate it at 1600. And therefore the flash ISO will also be 1600. Next to the ISO button, we have 3 different settings. TTL, A, which stands for automatic, I think, and we have manual. TTL only works on cameras that have TTL metering for flash. So the classic M6 that I have doesn't work with that. But I'm also not a big fan of using TTL with film cameras, because when you have a bright subject in the frame, like a white t-shirt or maybe a reflective sign, it can easily off-balance the metering of the flash. Then we have automatic. In my understanding, it uses the sensor in front of the flash, which I mentioned before, and I also don't use this setting. For the same reason as TTL, I like to be in control. But of course, if you want to, you can try it out. If you put it on auto, you can see the max distance, which is possible for the aperture and ISO settings that you set. In this case, 3.5 meters. If you get closer, in theory, the flash will output a lower power flash. So that leaves us with the last setting, which is manual. And this one just works perfect. Set the aperture and the ISO and adjust the power to the distance that you need for your subject. Once you've been using it for a while, it will be really quick. Above those modes, we have a thing that says OK. But I've never seen that thing light up, so maybe that's for the TTL function. Please let me know in the comments if you know what that is. And of course we have the on and off. It goes in sleep mode when you don't use it for a couple of minutes, but just make sure that you turn it off when not used. And below all of the settings we have the battery compartment, which uses 2 3-volt CR123s. These are pretty available and go a long time without having to change them. Lastly, we have at the bottom the hot shoe connector that, like I said, can transmit the TTL functions if your camera allows for it. And that's pretty much all that this little flash has to offer. I'll show you some examples with the flash settings next to it. This way you can see how I use the flash. As you can see, the subject is way closer than 1.2 meters, which was the lowest output for my settings. But color negative film can handle highlights and overexposure so well that I don't even bother with it. Just set the power to the lowest output and run with it. Oh, and before I forget, this is really important. You need to set your shutter speed to the max sync speed or below that. You probably will see a little flash icon on your shutter dial. Don't go higher than that, because otherwise you'll see your curtains in the frame. If you don't have a flash icon on your shutter dial, please Google it and make sure that you set the right shutter speed. You guys also had some specific questions about how to use the flash, so I'll try to answer them. How do you use this flash in street situations? It's exactly the same as how I use the flash in any situation. I like to zone focus, so I'll set my focus to, let's say, 2 meters, and then I make sure that the flash output is also at 2 meters. Maybe a little bit more to make sure there's enough light. I've got one and it's either too bright or too dark. Too dark, of course, means that there's not enough flash output, so I would make sure that you give it enough. Too bright sounds like you either overexpose it by 10 stops, or it's because of the scanning. Like I said in the previous example, I set my flash to 1.2 meters, while the subject was more like 30 centimeters in front of me. So it might be worth checking out the scanner settings. How to use this flash while including ambient light during the daytime? That's a good question. First thing you need to do is set the camera to the max sync speed, then meter the light and adjust your aperture. So it might be 1/40th with an aperture of f11. Then you set the flash to f11 and adjust the distance to your subject. But because it's such a slow shutter speed, it could also be f16 or maybe even higher than that. Definitely during bright days. But in general, first meter the ambient light and then adjust the flash to those settings. And that rounds it up. Hopefully I was able to clear things up and get all the questions answered. But if you have any left, please feel free to ask them down below in the comment section. If you like the content, think about subscribing to the channel, and also don't forget to hit that like button so this episode gets to a lot more people who might need this explanation too. For now, thanks for watching and I'll see you next week. Peace.